welcome back. Today is our first lecture in the series on the Americas. So we'll start off with the South American realm, then go into what is called either Middle America or Central America or Mesoamerica, and then we'll end with the North American realm. So to start off, let's go ahead and define our realms borders. And so South American realm is as a continent, if you want to consider it a continent. I know the definition of continents is a bit controversial and blurry. For this course, we're going to go ahead and cut it off right at Panama. So Panama and North will be considered part of Central America, and then everything that's kind of the mainland through here will be covered in South America. South America is smaller than North America. It's also smaller than Africa or Asia, of course, Africa being a very, very large continent. But it is larger than Europe. It's larger than Australia. So in terms of size, kind of in the middle there. It is the longest realm, which is interesting. It's 1/10 of the Earth's circumference. And that's going to play a big difference in terms of the vast variety we see here in terms of climate, vegetation, and people as well. So if we look at kind of our borders, we're going to have, of course, two major oceans. We have the Atlantic Ocean over here to the east, and we have the Pacific Ocean in the west. There are also a series of islands that are part of this realm, separate from, so all the islands that are going to be to the north as part of the Caribbean, sometimes called the Lesser Antilles, we're actually going to cover those in the Central American realm. But the ones that we might cover here are going to be things like Easter Island, which is actually off of the map here. You can't see it, but that is administered by Chile. The same with the Galapagos Islands. That is also off the map, but that is administered by Ecuador. We have the Falkland Islands here, which is going to be in the Southern Atlantic Ocean, and that's going to be a controversial point because it currently is governed by the United Kingdom, although Argentina also has been staking claim to it. So there have been battles between Argentina and the UK as to who controls the Falkland Islands. Some of the major physical features here are, of course, going to be the world's longest river. It's the world's longest in terms of the length of the river. It also is going to be the largest river in terms of discharge, and that's referring to the most volume of water moving through this river per year, and that is, of course, going to be the Amazon. Okay, you cannot talk about South America, I'll talk about the Amazon River, okay? So we've got our Amazon River here. Of course, it's many tributaries. That is going to be the world's largest river, both in terms of length and in terms of discharge. The other thing that you have to talk about here when talking about South America is, of course, the Andes Mountains. So we have a major mountain range going all through here, and we'll talk about more about what developed those. But something that's important for the Andes Mountains is it also comes with the Atacama Desert, which is going to be a major factor of South America as well, especially for the people who are living there. So if we look at, this is of course located on the equator, so we absolutely are going to have some very lush tropical rainforest conditions here, the very classic rich vegetation, lots of rain, but we're also going to have deserts here. We also have some major highlands here, so there's a huge range of what kind of vegetation and habitats you get in South America. So as I promised, let's talk about the Andes Mountains. So the very interesting thing of the Andes Mountains is they are a very classic feature of certain types of plate tectonic behavior. Okay, so the west side of the continent, it really is dominated by these Andes Mountains. Now with this map here, this is from the United States Geological Survey. This map here is talking about earthquake hazards. All right, so the reds and the oranges are going to be a higher seismic risk than those that are green. And the reason for this is it's based on how the Andes Mountains were formed. So the Andes Mountains are volcanic. We do have volcanic activity throughout South America as well as Central and North America. But what's happening here is the Nazca Plate, which is going to be this blue mass right here. The Nazca Plate, which is an oceanic tectonic plate, is being subducted beneath the South American plate, which is a continental plate. You can see these little black arrows here. That's showing the direction of movement. So what's happening is my oceanic plate, it's made of basalt. It is more dense, and so it's going to be on the bottom of the collision of my continental plate, which is going to be more granite and is going to be less dense and therefore is on top. So what's happening is, as these two collide, this is what we call a convergent plate boundary. These two plates collide, and the Nazca plate gets smushed and melted beneath the South American plate. So then, as you can imagine, if we're going to melt an entire tectonic plate, where does that material go? It has to go somewhere. So we've melted the rock down, and then it's going to erupt back up through these Andes Mountains. And again, that's why we see not just the volcano activity here, but a large amount of earthquake activity here as well, because you are literally crunching an entire tectonic plate and smushing it beneath another one. All right. So a pretty major feature there. Again, very classic example of what kind of landforms you have when you have a convergent plate boundary. Okay. The other big thing that we have in the Andes Mountains is the creation of a rain shadow. We've mentioned this in some of our other realms as well. So a rain shadow is going to be when you have, you think about a cloud that's containing water traveling through the air. Clouds can't move through mountains, right? Instead, they get forced upwards. And as those clouds get forced upwards, so they can go over the top of those mountains, they act kind of like sponges or squeegees. They get all the water squeegeed out of them. So by the time they get to the other side of the mountain, they've lost all of their rain. They already dumped it because they had to rise over these mountains. And so it's very common for the far side of mountains to be in what's called a rain shadow or a desert, okay? It's like kind of the shadow of the mountains. In this case, the Andes Mountains have created the Atacama Desert. It's going to be all across this border right here. And that's very much because these very, very high peaks just squeegeed out all of that moisture as those clouds are moving in from the other direction. This part through here is going to absolutely qualify as that highland climate category if you're looking at your different climate classifications. So very high elevation. People who have lived their whole lives in the Andes Mountains have adapted to living in high elevations. They have different lung and heart adaptations to that. But people who are visiting may have issues with altitude sickness. And so tourists may need to take medication to help with that because you do have to breathe differently in order to deal with higher altitudes. Okay, and so we call these high altitude valleys the Altiplanos. Okay, so within the Andes mountain range, right, we've got this lovely picture here of Altiplano in Bolivia. So if you have these mountain ranges, nestled within those mountains are going to be different valleys. They're still at high elevation, right? You still are going to have high altitude adaptations, but again, they're going to have that nice fertile volcanic soil. Volcanic soil is great for agriculture. Lots of water because as those clouds are being passed over, they dump their water before they go completely over the mountains. So if we look at the Andes Mountains, this is going to be the original settlements for the Inca tribe, and this is going to be one of the main indigenous groups of South America. There are, of course, many, many indigenous groups in South America. But I do want to touch specifically for now on the Inca because they were going to be a major empire here in the earlier part of this millennium. But yeah, there are, of course, far more indigenous groups in South America that I could possibly name. And as actually, if you look at a lot of groups doing a lot of activism work around the Belamonte Dam, I think it's the Xingu tribe, I'm not entirely positive, but they've been doing a lot of great advocacy work and work around the folks being relocated for dam work. Okay, so let's talk about the Inca Empire. Of course, this is one of the major empires of this realm. So the Inca Empire existed throughout the Andes from the 1100s up into the 1500s. And so its heyday really would have been in the 1400s, but it existed long before that. And at the height of its vastness, went all the way up into Colombia and all the way down into Chile and Argentina. Okay, a very, very large empire. And so you have a dry desert, again, the Atacama Desert, and a very high altitude. You may have read many news articles about the extremely well-preserved Inca mummies that have been found throughout the Andes. There is a museum of high-altitude archaeology that currently houses 3 children, the children of Yuyaco. I apologize, I don't speak Spanish. Yuyaco are 3 children, mummies who were found in the Andes. Very famous, and they're the most well-preserved mummies that have ever been found. And this is going to be a combination of that, again, very dry desert is going to remove fluids from the bodies, and high altitude, which then is going to partially freeze them as well. In fact, one of the mummies, they actually found frozen blood inside her heart. This is, of course, a very touchy issue because there is this kind of perception by, especially by a lot of Caucasians, that Native Americans are all gone, right? They're not extinct, right? Native indigenous peoples are very much still living here, and the descendants of the Inca Empire are still living in the Andes today. They are still living in their ancestral land. And so there has been a lot of indigenous groups that have expressed frustration and anger that these 3 children were taken from their burial site and are now on display for the public to view them. It's again, they were part of a human sacrifice, which was a very prestigious thing in the Incan Empire. It was seen as an honor. So it was a major part of at that time a religious ceremony. And so there are a lot of groups that are calling for these children to be returned back to their burial site. They are still currently being on display at the Museum of High Altitude Archaeology. However, archaeologists have agreed to not unearth any future tombs because there are still lots more tombs in the Andes. They're not going to unearth more out of respect of the wishes of the folks who are living there, because this is their culture and they would like to not have their ancestors disturbed. This picture here is going to be showing some of the modern tapestry and fabric works that the descendants of the Inca Empire work with today. So again, a large part of the folks who are living in Peru are descended from the Incan Empire. Very beautiful tapestry work, gorgeous work with textiles, and again, still very much living in the Andes today. But when we look into the 1500s, especially in the 1530s, we'll see the downfall of the Inca Empire due to European colonialism. Oops. So again, as I mentioned, there are many, many indigenous groups throughout South America. And the South American realm is incredibly diverse in terms of you have these deserts, you have high altitudes, you have very cold. In fact, if any of you decide to go to Antarctica, you actually would launch off from the tip of South America. It's not that far, right? Of course, we have the rainforest jungle around the equator and the Amazonian basin in parts of Brazil. And that's going to be, of course, its own perils there as well. You have, venomous and poisonous organisms, intense rain. But all the people who, again, were born and raised here have survived these conditions, right? And actually these conditions become part of their culture in many ways. Unfortunately, as we have covered, of course, colonialism and imperialism much in this class, that very much impacted this realm as well. And so you had multiple European colonizing forces come to South America. And so once Europeans arrived, really in the 1400s, 90% of the folks living in the Amazonian basin died really pretty right away. Very much going to be disease is, of course, a big runner, because if you think about populations in Europe are going to have been living with different microbes than the populations living in South America had a completely separate set of microbes. And so you had an entire population of the Amazonian people who just had no immunities to anything coming from Europe. So disease, of course, a big one. And then, of course, there are the more violent aspects of war and enslavement. And that absolutely happened. The Amerindian population in the Amazonian basin were enslaved by Spanish and Portuguese and French and British for work on plantations. So something that happened with the Inca government, okay, so again, the Amazonian population was very much hit hard by enslavement, war, and disease. With the way that the Inca government was set up, it was very centralized. You had a small group of people who were in charge of a very large empire, right? So there you had a ruling class within the Inca society, and that then governed all the subjects around them. And because of this, the Spanish are the ones that took over western side of South America. We'll talk more about the eastern side in a bit. And so they were pretty easily able to take control by just removing that central government factor and kind of just step in as the new rulers of this system. And so originally the Spanish imperialists used indirect rule, which we had taught in previous colonial lectures, but eventually switched to something called the Viceroyalty system. So in this Viceroyalty system, you'll remember that the indirect rule was when the Spanish would have had a person of Incan descent kind of as a figurehead to rule things for them. The switch to the Viceroyalty would be very much similar to the North American colony system, where you have a European figurehead. So we're not using someone of a local descent, but someone of a colonizing descent, who then reports back to Spain or Portugal, depending on if you're in the western or the eastern side of South America. And so the term viceroy are going to be these officers who then, again, being a European ruler for that colony and reporting back to the home sovereign. Okay, and then how this was created was something called land alienation, and this of course happened to indigenous communities throughout the world. And so the idea is that the European colonizers come in, take the land, and then you still have the people are still there, but instead of killing them off, you then force the native people to work the land as either slaves or indentured servants. Of course, the treatment of this would have been terrible, so you also had a lot of high casualty through that as well. So people are being disconnected from their land. They're having to work land that once their family land that they have now had taken from them, and now they have to work it against their will and without any type of payment. And so this happened throughout South America, throughout the Central America, and in parts of North America as well. In parts where large numbers of the native folks passed away, then we of course had the African slave trade, and we had folks from African descent being brought in to work as slaves here as well. So I keep mentioning Spain versus Portugal. So we kind of have to talk about the way that European powers divvied up this continent. Okay, so again, this is going to be starting in the 1400s when European powers were first coming to the Americas, or I should say, coming to Americas and staying here long term. We have seen that the Europeans were coming to parts of the Americas earlier. They just didn't stick around. So we do have Britain, France, and the Dutch did have some colonies here. But the big players, since you heard the term French Guiana, that's right here. But the big players in South America is going to be Spain and Portugal. And so they both got there in the 1400s, and there became this kind of battle of, well, who gets to rule this massive continent? Because very much was powered or fueled, the race here was gold and silver. And so you had European powers were very much like, hey, gold and silver, let's melt down these goods that are here. Copper was here as well, and take it back to the kings and queens of Europe. And then, of course, the labor force of forcing people to work here and grow new exotic foods that the people of Europe had never had before was also a factor. But gold and silver were going to be big, big motivators. Okay, so finally what happened in 1494, the Tordesillas line was created, and that's going to be this line right here. And it cut, it's roughly around 50 degrees west, and it cut the Spanish portion of South America off from the Portuguese portion of South America. And to this day, and so you can see the modern day state boundaries are going to be illustrated here. And that's significant because today in Brazil, most Brazilians don't speak Spanish, they speak Portuguese. All right, and that is going to be descended from this, is that Portugal was going to be covering the eastern portion of Brazil, versus folks from Colombia or Ecuador or Peru will often then speak Spanish. In addition to, of course, many indigenous languages like Quechua, lots of other indigenous languages here, of course, as well. Okay, and so then we kind of sort of had independence if we fast forward out of the colonial era. And I do mention colonial era because it is going to set the stage of how different cultures interact within this realm. So as we move forward into the 19th, 20th, and 21st centuries, of course, the legacy of colonialism never goes away. But in this realm, we see a very unique type of blending of cultures, and also the way that cultures keep separate while still interacting and creating new cultures as well. Okay, so now you have several generations have gone by, and now you have people who are European in descent, European by heritage, but they're now born and raised in South America. And so they also begin to say, you know, this whole viceroyalty thing, not fun. Very similar to many independent stories that we've seen of a lot of, especially British colonies, for example, the United States. Very similar story here as well. And so you had South American born descendants, but they still were wealthy landowners and European by descent. So there already is going to be a class and segregation issue here. Of course, race is going to be a major play in much of the politics in South America, as it is much of the world. And so in 1816, we have the independence of Argentina. We have Chile follow suit very near after. However, you didn't have full international recognition until the 1830s in some cases. Remember, part of the definition of being a state is other countries have to recognize you. And so again, we look back at so many, and again on your essays, many of you wrote about the different states that may or may not be recognized, or some countries may recognize them and others don't. And that, of course, played a role here in South America as well. Okay, until finally in the 1820s, we have the Monroe Doctrine. And at this point, the U.S. says, okay, Europe out of South America. And this was kind of the big factor of getting all the European colony claims. So not just the Spanish and the Portuguese, but Dutch and British and French, pushing all of that out of South America. Now, of course, the U.S. has had a very long history of imperialism in South America. You may have heard of the term Banana Republic, which we also see very much in Central America as well. So just because flat out plantation-based colonization stopped in South America does not at all mean that imperialism has stopped in South America. Okay, again, so now states that might be independent, they're still very much controlled by the wealthy of European descent. And so we do very much still see a lot of abuses and few rights for those of native descent. The settlers mostly stayed coastal. And so you're going to start to see this split of different communities living on the coasts versus communities living farther inland, either deep into the Amazon basin or deep into the Andes highlands. Okay, as with any place that has been colonized, religion is going to be a major factor of colonization along with language. And so Spain and Portugal are both Roman Catholic countries. In both of those countries, when they came to both Central, North, and South America, they brought the Catholic religion to their colonies. All right. In fact, today, about 80% of South Americans identify as Roman Catholic, although many folks do say they don't regularly practice. And this, of course, we see this throughout the world in many religions. And so you may have folks who identify as Catholic, but may not be devout, but it still overwhelmingly is going to be the dominant religion of South America. So if we look in terms of social views and things like birth control and LGBT rights, Roman Catholicism is going to be considered a more conservative religion. And there has been, and this is less so in recent years, much of this is because of Pope Francis, who's a much more progressive pope. But previous popes, there was a lot of accusations that the Catholic Church was so focused on social conservatism that it was ignoring the looks of the needs of the poor. And so a lot of the social problems going with like poverty, illiteracy, access to housing and food security, health for women and children. And so there's a lot of accusations that this religion was not addressing the needs of the poor. And of course, if any of you have ever been to, for example, the Vatican in Vatican City, it is a gorgeous, gorgeous building, but it's also a very, very wealthy building. The Roman Catholic Church is a very wealthy church. And so again, that kind of feeds into this accusations of it's a very wealthy church, but you're not meeting the needs of many of your people who are very poor. And again, Pope Francis has very much changed a lot of this. Okay, and so what happened in the 1950s you had many indigenous populations who had been forced to convert to Catholicism by Spanish and Portuguese conquistadors. A lot of indigenous populations started to move away from the Catholic Church and saying, this religion is not meeting my needs. A lot of it because of extreme poverty, very unequal distribution of wealth, which we have seen very much so in South America, in that even though the Spanish and the Portuguese are no longer in control of these countries, just the transfer of power just went to people of that descent in, so Chile and Argentina, still very much people who are of Spanish or Portuguese descent. Okay, so then we have this new movement called liberation theology, and this is going to be very much in the latter portion of the 20th century. So liberation theology is going to be a blend of teaching, so it is Christianity, but it's now Christianity with some socialist ideals, and very much is teaching that you still can be saved through Christ, not just by giving money to the church, but by being active in social movements, by raising awareness to help the poor, by doing political movements. And so liberation theology gained a lot of popularity, again, from the later portion of the 20th century, for people who wanted to be able to blend their Christian faith with serving people who are less fortunate. And so again, much more social and economic and political involvement in the name of the church. So I mentioned earlier that we're going to have different cultural regions here, and this is going to be partially because of the way that settlers settled and where their descendants remained after colonial powers had left. Okay, and these regions, they overlap on countries. Again, you can see the borders of countries here, but it's kind of going to show how you very much still have a core periphery idea within South America. Okay, and also we'll start to explain some of the cultural underpinnings of this realm. Okay, so you're going to have the tropical plantation. It's going to be here along the coast, and of course, called the tropical plantation because you had a lot of plantations here during the colonial era. And so again, we had indigenous folks who were forced to work, and then of course a very high number of African slaves worked here as well. In fact, today we still have a very large number of people here who are of African descent. And then we have the rural Amerindian, very much lining up with what once was the Inca Empire and part of the Andes. Andes, of course, going all through here. But again, you're going to have a very high portion of people of Incan descent who are still living in their ancestral homeland today. Very much of these parts of South America are very poor. Again, they're very rural and may not have access to as many services. And so there might be a high number of poverty here within this area here. Mixed mestizo, and we'll talk about what that word mestizo means in a bit. And so that's going to be kind of a lot of urban areas throughout here. That lighter green is going to be a lot of large cities, urban cities. Our Amazon basin, of course, is going to be where the Amazon River is. Right now we see a lot of development in the Amazon, so you may have, of course, seen some of the news coverage about how much the Amazon is being deforested. There are people living here still, right? We have a lot of cultures that are living here that are, trying to continue their ways of life that is being disrupted by agriculture, deforestation, slash and burn, and then, of course, dams we talked about in our dams lecture as well. And then the European commercial, sometimes called a southern cone, is going to be this bottom portion here. And it's called that because you have a much higher influence of European commerce here. And so many people here, again, are still linking back to European ties, either ancestrally or through commercial ventures. And again, I mean, the Falkland Islands is still UK, right? Now, as we talk about these cultural regions, it is important to talk about the role that all these different cultures play within this realm, okay? So in the US, for example, when you fill out a census, there's little boxes where they ask you to put your entire identity inside a little tiny box. And thankfully, in the year 2000, this was expanded that we could include, multi-ethnic and mixed race if we wanted to, because it's very hard to make one person identify into one box. We are much more complex than that. And then the way that race and ethnicity is viewed in South America is very different than how it's viewed in North America. Again, North America very much wants you to put yourself in that box, all right? All of these people here, and you can see there's a vast diversity and they are all different skin shades and facial features. All the people here are Brazilian. So when you think about what does it mean to be Brazilian, all of these people here are Brazilian. Okay, so South America is a land of cultural pluralism. We have a lot of different cultures living here, but they don't always mix. And so if you think about the analogy of the melting pot, which is used sometimes to describe the US, and that kind of gives the idea that we've all melted away our individuality to kind of blend together, it's more appropriate to say a salad bowl. And so, for example, if you have a salad, you want to enjoy that tomato separate from that crouton and that lettuce and that cucumber. Every individual piece of your salad is distinct in its own right. Your carrot is not the same as your cucumber, but all together they make a much better salad. So they're staying distinct, but they're blending together to make a better product. That's a weird analogy, but so the salad bowl idea we definitely see here in South America, where you have multiple cultures all together. Okay, when cultures do blend, this is where the term mestizo comes from. So these are folks who, if they were in North America, may choose to check the multi-ethnic box. Again, that's a very personal decision. But mestizo are people who are going to be of both Native American, Amerindian descent and European descent. Okay, and so people who are mestizo are going to be a large portion of the Amazon basin and again, a lot of cities. And so they have heritage back of both of the native population and the European population as well. Within Brazil, when you fill out a census, it's very different than how it is in the US. You don't check a box based on what your heritage is. It's more about your physical characteristics. And so race is defined very differently. There is no gene for race, right? There is not a gene that tells you what race you are. Ethnicity is different. If you do a 23andMe, that's going to be talking about, you know, are you Irish versus Italian? But there's not going to be a white gene or a black gene. That's not how race is. Very much a human defined thing. Ethnicity is going to be much more what we identify as ourselves and how we identify. Race is kind of a political box that people want you to check. A very interesting thing about South America is we have something called the Latin American city model. Now, we don't just see this here in South America. We see it in parts of Central America too. Although this particular one here is very interesting in that it has a feature that not a lot of other city models throughout the world have. And so we looked at some of our other realms. We mentioned the Central Business District. Okay, that's going to be our CBD. No, not that CBD, right? Our Central Business District, okay? And that, of course, is going to be where, like, you know, your commerce and your government's going to be. And as we saw in our African realm and parts of our different Asian realms, this CBD is going to have different interactions in terms of commerce and government, and also colonial powers and globalization as well. Now, what's very interesting about the CBD is going to be this spine and the mall that it attaches to. This spine along here is going to be where you have a large amount of commercial ventures and a lot of you know, retail and stuff, but it's going to be very high end. Now, a way to think of this is if you're looking at public transportation. So, of course, here in California, our public transportation still leaves something to be desired. At least I'm in California and my public transportation is not the best. However, if you look at the public transportation of many South American cities, there is an amazing network of systems that run up and down this spine. Especially Rio de Janeiro has a great central system that runs through here. So if my central business district here is going to be where all of the big players in terms of economy is going to be, this spine along through here is going to be then where all of your shops are. And the blue area is going to be where the wealthy live, because you want to be seen as you live along this spine. And so you can think about, you're going to have tree-lined boulevards through here, you know, very nice streets and roads and plazas and fountains where you can luxuriously stroll through this spine, peruse the shops. You can kind of compare it to some of the very fancy outdoor malls that we have here in California. And then the very, very elite would live in this blue area here, this elite residential sector. You're going to have very high-end homes. The mall is going to be providing more upscale services for the people who live here. So upscale groceries and such something are going to be through here. Okay. So we sometimes that's a big feature that we don't see in other city models, is going to be this spine, this boulevard spine that has then the high-end residential around it. Okay, the zone of maturity is going to be our older houses. Okay, and then the zone of in situ accretion, that's such a funny word. In situ accretion is going to be all this in here. And in situ means in place. So that means that there is development happening within this area as is. So if you think as the blue being the very, very, very rich, the yellow being, upper middle class, the green stripy is going to be this zone of transition, as there's lots of construction and lots of things developing. It's not as well established as my zone of maturity, but it's going to be a lot of growth and change and all that's happening in place. So in situ means that people are building their homes like around them. And then on the outside, you're going to have our periphery. Again, this idea of core versus periphery is something that happens throughout our entire class, right? So if you have this periphery, these are going to be a lot of settlements of the extremely poor. Sometimes they're called squatter settlements because people may not have the quote-unquote legal rights to that land. Depending on where you are, sometimes these are called barrios, sometimes they're called favelas. They're both going to be extremely low income, very, very poor areas where you may have people are building homes out of whatever they have access to. So they're not going to be like the professionally, cookie cutter built houses that you see in parts of the zone of maturity, or very, of course, mansions in the elite sector. But in your zone of maturity, you're going to have much more, the kind of standard store-bought homes you would see, versus in the peripheral squatter settlements, again, people may not have legal rights, so sometimes these settlements are bulldozed over by officials trying to clear folks out, and then people just come back in and rebuild. And so very, very low income, very high amounts of poverty, and then depending on different places, call them either barrios or favelas. Okay, but the big thing about this Latin American city model that we don't see is this idea of this promenade for folks to be able to walk through, not very much drive through, but transport through, as we do have some really great railway systems in some cities through here, where you then can look at all the famous rich people who live along this path here. Okay, that's all I have for this lecture. Go ahead and take your quiz, and I shall see you next time. Thanks, bye.